Joining me now from Chicago is Omar Shakir. He is the Israel-Palestine director over at Human Rights Watch. Omar, pleasure to have you on the show. Let me begin by asking you, do you feel that there's a concern that the number of human rights violations could dramatically increase with Israel commencing with its ground operations in the Gaza Strip?
It's hard to even imagine an increase from the unprecedented levels of bloodshed, carnage, slaughter, and human rights abuse that we've seen in recent days. But certainly there are warning signs that there are further mass atrocities to come. The last time the Israeli army invaded Gaza, did a mass invasion in 2014, Human Rights Watch documented war crimes, including Israeli officials fatally shooting civilians. Of course, we continue to see relentless aerial bombardment of Gaza. Again, this is a 40 by 11 kilometer strip of land where 2.2 million people have been under relentless bombardment, the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects on a densely populated area, which creates significant risk, foreseeable risk to civilians. We've seen entire city blocks and large parts of neighborhoods reduced to rubble. And this is happening with a population, the majority of whom have been displaced, nearly half of whom have had their home destroyed or damaged, almost all of whom have been without electricity, water, only a trickle of humanitarian aid, for days, for weeks. So the situation is quite dire with the threats to hospital, with the ground invasion expanding, with bombardment continuing. It is a human catastrophe that's man-made and that could become even worse in the days ahead.
Omar, does giving warnings before they conduct operations like Israel says it's doing, I mean, we know that some Palestinian doctors are refusing to leave hospitals. Does it absolve them from the requirement to protect civilians?
Absolutely not. I mean, hospitals have special protections under international humanitarian law. Doctors, medical workers, patients must be protected in all circumstances. And while in other situations, if there was a legitimate military target, an army would have, the ability to act subject to the rules of international humanitarian law. Not the case with hospitals. The threshold under international law is much higher. There must be a showing that the hospital is being used to actively contribute to aiding the enemy's acts in a way that causes harm. Nothing that the Israeli government has put forward. And even then, there must be a clear warning. When evacuation is not possible, it absolutely should be a last resort. And the people who are unable to evacuate in all circumstances still enjoy the protections of international humanitarian law against disproportionate attacks attacking a hospital in the current circumstance where you have tens of thousands of displaced people, and the Israeli government has now threatened every hospital in the Gaza City and northern Gaza with evacuation. That would lead to absolute travesty. It should not happen.
One of the travesties that's ongoing is the dire humanitarian situation. I mean, under international humanitarian law, I mean, a country, or in this case, Israel, it's required, I mean, as the occupying power, or at least one that maintains effective control over the territory, to make sure that the basic needs of the population of that enclave are met, such as food, water, electricity. That certainly isn't the case.
No, I mean, Israel's committing multiple war crimes just with this particular example that you ask about. On one hand, to punish an entire civilian population for the actions of, individuals, some fighters on October 7th, heinous crimes they committed. That's collective punishment. It's a war crime under international law. Separately, while, warring parties have the ability to monitor shipments to ensure that there's no, weapons, etc., you cannot entirely block the entry of life-saving aid. That is also a war crime when done deliberately, as the Israeli government is doing so. And as you note, Israel retains the obligations as an occupying power in Gaza of international humanitarian law, which means they must provide for the welfare of the civilian population. That includes providing electricity, water, medicine, food. And you have a reality now where the population has not had those things for 3 weeks. And it's absolutely insane that the international community has not put pressure on the Israeli government to allow in basic services, restore basic services, and allow in humanitarian aid. The trickle coming in through Cairo is not enough to meet the needs of the
Yeah.
population. It is, 20 trucks, which has been the average, some days a bit more, some days a bit less. That's about 4% of what entered before this all began. And before this all began, Gaza was under a closure that had rendered 80% of the population relying on humanitarian aid. So we have a very dire humanitarian situation. Lives are already in grave danger. Lives have already been lost because of the lack of clean water, medicine, food, and other basic services.
Omar, I also have to touch upon the other side. I mean, Hamas is also continuing to indiscriminately launch rockets over the border as well. I mean, these are violations of humanitarian law on that side as well.
100%. You're absolutely right. Human Rights Watch has documented, during rounds of escalations, rockets. These are indiscriminate weapons. They're not able, and they're going over Israeli communities. And even though, again, they cause less damage because of Iron Dome, because many of the communities have been evacuated, that doesn't make them any less of a war crime. These are the same indiscriminate protection against indiscriminate strikes that we've documented with Israeli airstrikes over the years. It's the very same principle of international law. But let's be clear, one side's, war crimes doesn't justify the other side's war crimes. And I think that's the basic principle we've been trying to articulate. October 7th, the assault, the killing, the hostage taking, those were war crimes. That doesn't justify the war crimes that Israel's committing in Gaza. And the fact that Hamas is firing rockets doesn't justify indiscriminate Israeli airstrikes over Gaza. So I think we have to understand that international humanitarian law was set out to protect civilians. It's not a deal between fighters, it's a deal with humanity, and humanity is failing to uphold these basic standards.
Omar Shakir, pleasure having you on and speaking with you. Thank you.